First, we'll talk Bret Bielema making his comments to Bo Mattingly earlier this week in the aftermath of the NFL draft. We discussed it some last week, and some guys that weren't drafted that were extremely productive players. And it's always a difficult thing to see some of these guys who leave early, in fact, who are then undrafted. And with everything that the NFL has provided in regards to scouting reports and analysis to give these kids some information going into it, things change during the course of the draft. Dominoes fall. Opinions are changed that sometimes cause some of these kids to slip off if there are particular position needs that don't fall their way, and then they're left in a precarious situation, even though we know that a number of undrafted free agents will make NFL rosters this year. I think it's been in the mid-30s across the board, but that's all conferences, top to bottom, contributing to that number. So, David, we'll start with you. Bret Bielema makes his case, and he's trying to round up some support from some big-time college football coaches, not just in the SEC, but around the country, to give these kids an opportunity, underclassmen who went undrafted, to be able to come back to school and maintain their status as active players.
You brought up, he's trying to get other coaches, and to me, for the coaches, this would be, they were going to have to start juggling a newfound dilemma if this does happen in building a team roster. We know the team roster is 85, limit scholarship, but rarely do the teams go over. But it would be starting maybe a dangerous precedent of coaches letting players go through spring practice that's already there, and then all of a sudden these guys who don't get drafted are coming back. So, this would be a newfound dilemma for coaches to start juggling numbers, similar to what college baseball coaches do when their players go to the draft and, they have a chance to come back. So that would be really, weird for these coaches to have to start counting back players that they really weren't counting on maybe once they've left. And I think as far as the players go, there's general questions, I think. Would they be allowed to hire agents? And what would their withdrawal from school look like? Would they still be in classes, or would they get a reprieve in some kind of way and, not really be mandated to attend classes? And, one big problem I see, with the risk of being unwanted by the NFL and maybe unable to go back to college football, will more underclassmen start, doing this? Will the numbers go up even more for, hey, you have a chance to come back now? So I think we might see even more of a mass exodus of players just trying to test the NFL waters and see what happens. So, and that kind of goes back to the point of these coaches won't know what players they can really count on coming back.
So I believe the coach's heart's in the right place. So I'm going to credit him for that. He feels bad about the situation that these athletes have placed themselves in, and they do have some information. So they're not, in this day and age, for the past 5 or 6 years, I think that's generally what we're talking about, gone into this blind. They have had the information given to them by scouting reports from the NFL to get an idea of where their value is placed. I don't think there's any question that there will be more players who will declare for the NFL draft if this goes into motion. I don't think it will, but if it would, there's no risk, depending on what guidelines are placed around that declaration for the NFL draft. The first thing that comes to mind for me, we already have players that are protecting their status and protecting themselves from injury going into postseason play and going into bowls. That number is only going to grow, which has compromised bowl play, and that hurts me quite a bit. So, Mike, what do you think about Bielema's idea?
Well, Mark, I think it's pretty generous of you to give Bret Bielema the benefit of the doubt that he's thinking about the players first instead of getting one or two of those guys back for his next team. I'm sure that has nothing to do with it. As with all the player advocates of the NCAA, it's always about the player first, which it should be. But I'm not sure that that's Bielema's complete reasoning behind this. Here's my thought on this whole comment. What Bielema's trying to do is trying to give the players an out for really making a poor business decision. And the way he's proposing to do that is by making it easier to make a poor business decision in the future for athletes. he's concerned about the athlete that just chose to become eligible for the draft, and the way he's trying to help that athlete is by making it easier for athletes in the future to choose to go to the NFL draft. So I'm not sure. It's one of these things that we deal with in college football all the time, where it sounds really good about putting the student athlete first, but when it comes to the practical matter, the implementation of the idea, sometimes it just doesn't pass muster. To add a little bit of detail to what David was saying, National Signing Day is in February. Now, of course, the student athletes don't have to sign in February. That's just the first day they can sign. So going back to what David talks about, signing day is in February and the draft is in April. All right, so then the coach has to juggle. If he's got two guys like Dan Mullen does that may or may not get drafted in the NFL, does he sign a class of 18 this year, or does he sign a class of 20? And if he signs a class of 20 and those two guys don't get drafted, what does he have to do to bring those two guys back in the fold? So I think when you look at the actual implementation of it, it probably won't pass the scrutiny of detail. The other issue is, if they hire an agent, are they able to come back, or do some guys who hire agents not eligible to come back, and guys who don't hire agents are eligible to come back? Is that fair? If a guy leaves school, can he come back, or maybe he can't come back? But if a guy stays in school, he can come back. And so that hurts his prospects at the combine. So is that fair? The other thing you're likely to see if this idea gains traction is tying it to academics. If a guy is on track to graduate, maybe the NCAA allows him a 6-month sabbatical, a 1-semester sabbatical, and maybe some sort of academic allowance against the 85 scholarship count. But if a guy's not on track to graduate, if he's not current with his academic status and credit hours, maybe he's not allowed to come back if he declares for the draft. Is that fair? So there's going to be, once you look at the details of this, there's going to be a lot of fair, not fair. If this guy does that, that guy does that. I don't think it's going to pass muster once everybody starts looking into the details of it. The other way you solve it is just to not have juniors. You can declare for the draft, but going back to the old days where you can't go through the combine and you can't come out of school, and if you get drafted, sure, you can go to the NFL. If you don't get drafted, you continue on doing what you're doing. So it could go the other way as well. So again, I think it's one of those things that sounds great when you couch it in terms of helping out the student athlete, and that's absolutely a legitimate argument. But once you get to the details, it kind of loses its luster a little bit.
Yeah, Mike, and you mentioned helping the student athlete, but what I'm kind of afraid of is this, in a way, a first step of admitting, like, for football players, college is now more of a profession while they're in school than it is scholarship first and athletics second. Is this what is it basically this is what they're going to train for? This is what it looks like to me. It can kind of set up to look like, okay, well, football's first and then your academics are second. You're taking this semester off, and whether you get drafted or not, you have a chance to come back. So, and I agree, you said you had some stipulations there about the sabbatical and how they could come back. But I do worry that it sets, a look of where football is first and academics are second.
I'd actually also change. Go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was just going to say, I was going to play off your first point, Mike, and I think it's a really valid one. I don't think it should necessarily be taken into consideration, but it's kind of a periphery, but that I think is extremely important in the maturation of young men and individuals in general, and that's how many of us get a reprieve in making huge decisions in life. If we take the wrong job, if we move our family across the country, you can fill in the blank from there. Do we get a reprieve? No, we have to deal with the circumstances. We have to deal with the information in front of us, and this is part of the process of growing up, and we're basically giving them a huge safety net in the process. I don't think that necessarily should be taken into consideration, but I think that's part of the maturation process, is understanding that there are pros and cons to every situation. There is hardly ever a slam dunk decision to be made out there that everything lines up and this is the obvious road to take. There's usually a thought process, and you have to go with a combination of gut feeling and how it's going to affect others, and primarily information, and then make the best decision. I do say, Mike, that Yeah, let's face it, Bret Bielema is thinking of himself in addition to the student athletes, but I think he's being possibly a little short-sighted here because, okay, he lost one player in Denver Kirkland, good football player. I got to think over the course of time that his chief rivals in the SEC Western Division are going to be hurt far more by this, or are going to be, I'm sorry, going to be helped more by players coming back after not being drafted in the likes of Alabama and LSU versus what Arkansas brings to the NFL, or those fringe players that don't quite make the NFL. And then one last thing, we talked about school and the academic side of this, and I don't necessarily know how to legislate this off the top of my head, but I think there has to be some connection maintained to school and academics. It can be lightened based on the work and the preparation that needs to go about in preparing for the NFL draft through the NFL Combine and all the academies that they have set up to work out these players prior to the NFL draft in May. But there has to be some level of commitment maintained to school, in my opinion, if this has any chance of being passed legitimately.
And Mark, we talk about the student athlete first. It's going to have two negative ramifications on the academic portion of college life. One, if you're a coach and you've got a 5-star recruit, you're almost not able to redshirt him because that redshirt year, obviously because the 3-year clock to the NFL draft starts even for the redshirt year, he's not going to be able to use that redshirt year like a lot of guys do to front load their academics. The other thing is a lot of football players use the spring semester to catch up on their academics and take a little bit heavier of a workload than they do in the fall. If I'm a redshirt sophomore that thinks I can get drafted in the 6th or 7th round and I leave school that second semester, even if I am allowed to come back, I'm probably going to be well behind the rest of the team in my academics. That's going to hurt the APR. So I think, to your point about the maturation process of the college athlete, part of taking care of college athletes is helping them make the right decision. Oftentimes we forget these are 19, 20-year-old men who still need a little bit of guidance and mentorship in life. So I think the argument of putting the student athlete first is kind of a false narrative in this case. There's a lot of bad parts about the student athlete part about this idea going forward.